and also season of the year, and also outdoor temperature to make sure that they corrected for all those, they were able to show that when the percentage of hours of sunlight in the last 7 days got less and less and less, there was worsening in glucose metabolism and also in lipid metabolism in those subjects. So let's talk a little bit about the actual amount of damage that light can do. We've talked about all the benefits of light, and we haven't really talked about the damage that light can do. Now, what you see here is a spectrum of light going from the ultraviolet here on the left-hand side, and then the visible spectrum here with infrared going in this direction. As you can see on this graph, which is graphing basically the amount of radicals that are manufactured. So this is basically a graph of oxidative stress from light in the different categories. And you can see here that ultraviolet A is very adept at creating reactive oxygen species and oxidative damage. UVB also being somewhat high, but not as much. And you can see that as we go down in energy in terms of light, the amount of oxidative stress, the amount of damage is much, much less. The type of light that you want to avoid is ultraviolet radiation, not so much infrared. It does not cause as much damage. And that's important when we're understanding about when we're going to go out into the sun. What do we do about the concerns of melanoma and skin cancer and those sorts of things? Well, it's interesting because here was a study that was done, almost 1,000 cases of melanoma, looked at 513 in the population and 174 sibling controls that were recruited in England. And they looked to see what was protective in the relationship between sun exposure and melanoma risk. And what they found was very interesting. They said, quote, overall, the clearest relationship between reported sun exposure and risk was for average weekend sun exposure in warmer months, which was protective. In other words, if you had weekend sun exposure, that reduced your risk of melanoma in these subjects. They say serum vitamin D levels were strongly associated with an increased weekend and holiday sun exposure. There's no surprise there. The more you're out in the sun, the more vitamin D you're going to be making from the ultraviolet B radiation. What about the risk factors for dying from melanoma? This was a study that was published back in 2005, and they looked at what things were associated with increased death in melanoma and what things were associated with a decreased death rate in melanoma. And you can see that things that were associated with an increased death risk was melanoma thickness, mitosis, ulceration, and head and neck placement. So mitosis is when you're seeing the cell divide under the microscope. Things that were associated with decreased death was actually things that are associated with being in the sun. So sunburn was actually associated with a decreased death. High intermittent sun exposure was decreased. Something called solar elastosis, that's kind of the damage that you have to your skin if you're out in the sun for too long, was actually associated with a decreased death rate. I'm not saying that going out into the sun, you're going to be fine and never get melanoma. I want you to listen to your dermatologist. But remember that near infrared radiation, the thing that stimulates melatonin production in the mitochondria, can penetrate through clothes. And so you don't need to go out into the sun directly. You don't need to be going out and sunbathing without protection. It can penetrate through clothes. It can penetrate through sunscreen. But just to say, you don't have to be afraid of going outside even when the sun is out. You can do this, and remember that the green leaves reflect a lot of that near infrared radiation. Here's a study that was done titled Avoidance of Sun Exposure is a Risk Factor for All-Cause Mortality, results from the Melanoma in Southern Sweden cohort. This was a very large study, about 30,000 women selected at random, 35 to 64 years of age in southern Sweden, and they were followed prospectively for 20 years. And there was about 2,500 deaths over those 20 years. And they asked about, did they go to the suntanning salon or were they sunbathing? And this is what they showed in the data. They showed that those that had avoided sun exposure, they had sun avoiding behavior, their survival rate was this line here at the bottom. Whereas those that had the most active sun exposure were those here at the top. So this is a large study and a very large and long follow-up. Most Swedes, of course, are fair-skinned. And so this can be something that's applicable to a population that's at risk for melanoma.
That was really interesting to see that graph with UVA and UVB and the amount of oxidative stress that those portions of the light spectrum cause relative to infrared. And most sunscreens that people buy these days are broad spectrum sunscreens, meaning they help block out both UVA and UVB. But I also want to ask about, you mentioned melanoma, but there's other skin cancers out there. There's basal cell carcinomas and there's squamous cell carcinomas. They're not as deadly as melanoma typically, but what are your thoughts on, people that are concerned about all types of skin cancer and want to stay out of the sun, also because they don't want wrinkles. A lot of people want to avoid the sun for those reasons. So what's a strategy they can use to still get infrared radiation?
So I too am also very conscious of sun exposure. I mean, I'm tinning a little bit here on the top, so I wear a hat. So it protects me from the ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And obviously wearing clothes, shirts, things of that nature can do the same. But the key here is that infrared radiation can penetrate through those layers of clothing. So I can still feel the warmth of the sun on my head, even though I'm wearing a cap. And so, yeah, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, even sun damage, actinic keratoses, these things are related to the oxidative stress that is occurring from that particular portion of the spectrum of light, which is in the ultraviolet spectrum. And that can be mitigated by making sure you're wearing sunscreen, that you're covering up, but you can still go out, even though you're covering up, into the outside and get that infrared radiation because it will penetrate those protective barriers.
And if you forgot your hat or you don't have a way to cover your skin or you forgot your sunscreen, can you still be in the shade and benefit from near infrared?
Well, absolutely. So remember that the sun is shining down on these green leaves, these plants, the grass, which are highly reflective of near infrared radiation. So even though you're not in the sun, you could be in the shade, you're still getting the benefit of that near infrared radiation that's hitting you, even though you're not in direct sunlight. Here's a paper that was done looking at the interdependence and contributions of sun exposure and vitamin D to